Hi, today is May 6th, 2025. My name is Colin Goldberg, and I'm here today with poet and language artist Sasha Stiles. Sasha is a Kalmyk-American poet and language artist whose award-winning work bridges tradition and innovation through hybrid poetics, generative information, imagination, and collaborative intelligence. Her transmedia practice reframes poetry as both art and technology, a means of encoding experience across time, and blends word, image, and algorithm to explore human voice in a digital age. A co-founder of theVERSEverse and a graduate of Harvard and Oxford, she has served as a poetry mentor to the AI humanoid Bina 48, Bina 48 since 2018 and lives near New York City. So welcome, Sasha. I'm really happy to have the opportunity to chat with you a little bit about your work. And as we talked about before the interview started, I am a fan. I purchased your book, and I really think it's interesting what you're doing in terms of presenting poetry in a kind of a new way and recontextualizing it to like a visual art audience, and also the combination with I think is really, really interesting and timely. So
Well, thank you so much for the kind words, and right back at you. I'm also a fan, and I'm so happy we get to have this conversation at long last. Feels like it's just about time. Yeah, so thank you for the invitation.
absolutely, absolutely. So would you mind telling us a little bit about your background, like just general stuff, where you were born, where you live and practice now, and maybe some cultural influences?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born actually in California, so not too far, in the States. But I grew up on the West Coast, and then kind of moved over here with my family when I was in grade school. But my dad is British. My mother is Kalmyk-Mongolian. She was actually born overseas in Germany in a refugee camp after the war. Her family had been displaced, so we kind of come from all over the place, going back even further. But these days I'm here on the East Coast, as you said, just outside New York. I am really a lifelong lover of words and language. That's kind of my first love, and I really just grew up in a household that was just full of books, and I think that's just been, part of my being for as long as I can remember. So I've been writing. I've been trying to write poetry for years and years since I was really young, and I've always been really interested, I think, in the relationship between language, as more of an ephemeral thing, something that we speak and that kind of disappears into the air, but then also language as a material, language as something more tactile and aesthetic. I love poetry, I think, because I very much care about the appearance and the aesthetics, and sort of the tactility of language. And for me, over time, that's kind of evolved from being very interested in what language looks like, on maybe a printed page or on a written page or on a canvas, to, into this realm of poetics as sort of filtered through, multimedia, kind of a hybrid poetics that really is about what's next beyond the written page. How can the word kind of come alive and kind of test the limits of literacy as we recognize it. And, to that end, I've always been like rather interested in this intersection of text and technology. Um, and over time, I've really come to sort of think about the relationship, the kinship between poetry and technology. Which has been really kind of at the root of my practice, for quite some time now. But that's been something that I think is really informed by the fact that I, like you, like so many of us, kind of grew up, into and through the rise of personal computing, the advent of the World Wide Web, the arrival of social media and smart devices, and all these things that have just been so kind of dominant in culture, in which, I don't have the same experience of, from those very, very early formative days. So having kind of gone through this analog to, ultra digital kind of experience, that's also kind of an undercurrent for everything that I do. And so I feel like a lot of my poetics is about kind of grappling with the changes, the transformations in how humans communicate with one another. And to me, poetry is a very sort of useful and beautiful lens through which to kind of consider a lot of those transformations. And at the end of the day, just to be able to play with words using lots of different modalities, from pen on paper to artificial intelligence is really just endlessly interesting to me.
Wow, yeah, that's really I think that it's kind of interesting because you and I have similar um, kind of paths, although I went into the sort of digital side of things and you're on the language side of things. But at some point, I started out as a painter and then, but was also, interested in computers in sort of a parallel way. And then
Mhm.
at one point they crossed paths and that really changed my
Mhm.
practice. And I was wondering, was there sort of like a seminal moment where, as a poet, you started incorporating technology either in a content based way or in sort of methodology based way that you could, pinpoint?
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting thinking about the resonances. There's definitely a lot that we have in common. So I think there's different moments along the way that maybe were important for different reasons. But I mean, I remember even before integrating technology as a medium or as a material in that way, I was writing about technology in different ways in my conventional poetry, even back to grade school. Like I remember being really interested in Greek myths about, the automata and kind of thinking through the idea of these ancient robots and, using poetry, classical poetry as well to sort of like think through just the timelessness of this impulse to think about creating machines or creating systems somewhat in our likeness. So I think that probably was instilled at a young age and was really shaped by a lot of, again, I had a lot of books around me, but I was really interested in science fiction and things like that. So and I've talked about this elsewhere, but my parents make science documentaries. They're filmmakers, and my dad in particular has a really deep interest in space exploration. So I would tag along quite often when I was young, when they were, shooting with folks at NASA JPL or the Planetary Society, places like that, in California where I grew up. And it was just really, it always struck me as just being incredibly poetic and creative, to be in that world and to kind of think beyond these perceived limits and wonder more about what's out there, what's possible, and how technology and engineering could enable us to explore those other realms that would be otherwise invisible to us. So I think that's kind of a deep foundation, maybe not in a literal way, but that's always made me very sort of aware of and deeply attracted to the connections between art and science and art and technology and poetry and technology. And then, I think along the way, there were some formative encounters with other artists and writers who have experimented with generative poetics, both digital and, computational, but also kind of analog algorithmic poetry and experiments like what William Burroughs was doing with Brian Geisen, for example, cutting up pages of poetry and rearranging words, to kind of form new meanings, things like that. I encountered those moments, um, I guess, of more experimental poetics, kind of outside the canon that I would study in school. And I always was really struck by that and felt much more drawn to some of the avant-garde writers and some of the experimental school and the Dadaists and the Surrealists and the beat poets who were doing, a little, maybe they were doing things that were a bit outside the realm of what I was reading in the Norton Anthology of Poetry. And I always just felt more of a sense of recognition with that approach. So I think that really kind of has underpinned a lot of this as well. And I remember walking through a museum at one point and encountering a work called The House of Dust by the Fluxus artist and poet Alison Knowles. And this is a work of computational poetry that was done back in 1967, and basically is these buckets of phrases that are rearranged by an algorithm into quatrains, into stanzas of a poem. And I was just so struck by the beauty of these machine assembled phrases. And I do viscerally remember that being a moment of just being sort of awestruck by the creative capability of human and machine collaboration. And that kind of opened my mind up to a lot of new possibilities that I hadn't studied as a student of, literature in more of a traditional sense.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think, I could see your work as almost like the creation of an inventor in some ways, which is, interesting. Your parents have this science background. I too have parents, or my parents actually met when they were chemistry students, so they're both scientists.
Oh,
And yeah,
wow.
they met when they were doing their PhD studies actually in chemistry. So I grew up
Amazing.
with, my mom had chemical and engineering news on the kitchen table. Um, it was maybe a little different than, some of my friends' households in that way, but I always appreciated like the idea of the experiment, and it was something that just seemed very
Yeah,
normal and natural to me. So
yeah,
I think that's interesting. And also like I never heard about the that sort of early generative poetry. I think that's really interesting though, and how it ties into things like the
yeah.
surrealist exercise of the exquisite corpse and other things
Mhm.
that might be visual kind of correlates to that. So um,
Yeah.
that's really interesting. And as far as like were there any like as far as your influences go,
Mm.
in terms of more traditional poets, like who would you consider your influences in that realm?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I always kind of go back to T.S. Eliot, who, I mean, that's not like it's not a surprising choice probably, but I love T.S. Eliot. I think for a lot of the reasons that I like working with artificial intelligence, actually, I think there's a lot of weird similarities that I only now, can sort of see. But I was always drawn to sort of the way that Eliot kind of taps into, I would say, a writer's version of the collective consciousness, and really is sort of bringing together lots of different allusions and references and different languages and quotations from different people and voices, and kind of pastiching a lot of it together and creating something that is, greater than the sum of its parts, but that relies on all these different kind of fragments that are assembled through the poet's vision. Um, to me, that feels incredibly powerful, and this idea that it's the poet's job to sort of absorb culture and absorb history and absorb lots of different languages and stories, and then kind of refract something of a unique experience of all those collective experiences, the plural. I think that to me has always felt like a really interesting sort of counterpoint to the prevailing I guess, preference in mainstream poetry for more of like the lyric kind of narrative confessional mode. Um, and to that end, I mean, I've always loved poets like Walt Whitman as well, and Allen Ginsberg, and a lot of writers who I think are really um, maybe best known for creating and cultivating a voice that is really, trying to be um, representative of something universal in a way. Still focusing very much on the personal, still focusing very much on the intimate and the body and the human, but recognizing that individual experience is really informed by being part of an organism of humanity. So I think, those poets always come to mind, but um, I spent a little bit of time in school also studying the classics, and I was especially interested in ancient Latin poetry. And I mean, I remember just, some of my fun experiences from being a student were translating Catullus, from Latin into modern English. And it was really, really fun to kind of have the experience of sort of communing in a dead language with a long dead poet and feeling the words come alive. And I loved reading Catullus and Horace and like lots of those Latin writers, but I also loved Sappho and some of the ancient Greek writers, and loved Sappho's fragments. And that's that's a body of work that I've continuously referenced in a lot of the work that I do now, and really kind of reaching back to, ancient languages, archaic poetry, fragments of literature that have persisted for hundreds or thousands of years. To me, there's something really appealing about, yeah, I guess looking back that way and kind of communing with these very ancient authors, and kind of recognizing where there's similarities, where there's, kind of eternal impulses that I still recognize, and then where there's differences and departures. So, there, yeah, there are quite a few, I guess, of those poets from the very, very olden days who are really important to me. But then I also, I read really voraciously, and I love a lot of contemporary poets like Dennis Smith and Ocean Vuong and Sally Wen Mao and Victoria Chang. And like, there's so many wonderful poets writing today who are also, I would say, not widely represented in the literary canon that has informed a lot of, artificial intelligence systems, for example. So when I started working with AI to write poetry, it was very important for me to kind of augment some of those canonical references like Eliot and Whitman and Sappho and Homer and, all those folks. It was really important to augment that with contemporary voices and bring in poets that, that I love to read, whose voices I think are very important when we're thinking about refracting experiences of what it means to be human today.
That's really interesting. I actually studied Latin in high school. I took
Oh,
3 years.
you're kidding.
Yeah, so yeah, we didn't actually have a Latin program at first because there weren't enough students that were interested in it. So my mom took the liberty of reaching out to all of my classmates' parents and saying, "Hey, you
Oh.
should sign your kids up for Latin," which didn't make me very popular.
That's amazing.
Ended up doing, I think it also influenced me in seeing the way that, in terms of sort of just generally an interest in like etymology and combining words. And that's another thing I thought was really interesting about your book, Technology, is how it's this portmanteau similar to Techspressionism. Um,
Yeah.
and I just it really, maybe that's part of what, really interested me when I saw the book. And then I bought it and I started reading through it, and could definitely relate, to growing up alongside the personal computer. I remember there was one piece about like 10 years ago, looking back, or maybe looking forward from 10 years back.
Yeah.
Um, you know, uh, it's really interesting. I remember when the web first started, I was working in a multimedia shop doing CD-ROMs, and the owner came in and said, there's this new way to distribute multimedia. It's called the World Wide Web. And
Mm.
I never imagined it becoming so embedded in our culture and everyone's life. Computers
Mm.
prior to that were much more of sort of a fringe activity, I think, and it's just become so pervasive. Uh,
Yeah.
it's really interesting, and so I noticed too in some of your talks that I was looking at online. You have this interest in transhumanism, and I was kind of wondering if you could sort of expand on that for maybe a general audience in terms of what that's all about and what interests you about it.
Sure. Um, yeah, and thanks for sharing all that too. You have such a cool mom that that pushed you into Latin. That's really interesting. And yeah, good to know we have all those resonances too. Um, yes, so let's see, where should I pick up on that exactly? Um, Transhumanism. So to me, I've gotten really interested in transhumanism and posthumanism over the years, I think, because like I mentioned before, I kind of grew up really steeped in science fiction. And so it's always sort of been of interest to me to sort of think about possible futures, speculative futures, things like that. And like I said before, I read quite voraciously, and I got very interested in reading books by folks like Ray Kurzweil, who were kind of thinking very deeply in this arena, and sort of thinking about the philosophical and existential implications of advances in our technologies. And so in my understanding and kind of in the way that I think about it, transhumanism is really this idea that, we are augmented as human beings by our inventions and our technologies in ways that extend our capabilities and allow us to do things that we can't do without those technologies. And so it's really sort of thinking about how our humanity is sort of changed, transformed, extended, augmented, altered, possibly transcended through technological innovation, and and then sort of thinking in terms of the evolution beyond that into post-humanism. I think when I first started to really kind of think about the word post-humanism, it sounds very sort of dystopian, right? The idea of being beyond, past humans, humans no longer being here, not being relevant, humans being obsolesced in a way. But I think, what I've come to sort of associate with that term is sort of, again, this continuation of the evolution of possibility of kind of the extension of the current human condition as we know it into something maybe more complex or more nuanced, something that's more than human rather than post-human, but really kind of looking at how maybe our growing ability to kind of sense the world around us, the way that technology kind of changes our ability to perceive things or to parse information, or gives us, I guess, endows us with the ability to see or to understand aspects of the world around us that are otherwise invisible to us. How does that sort of change the way we regard ourselves and the planet around us and the other species around us, and really kind of looking at how technology can actually help dissolve some of the boundaries that are currently in place and help us feel maybe more of a kinship with other intelligences, whether they're artificial or organic or synthetic or plant or animal. But I think all of that is kind of wrapped up in those terms, both transhumanism and posthumanism in different ways.
Hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, I could definitely I could see where you're coming from with that. Uh, I noticed in your in that particular piece, I think that was about 10 years prior, there was a
Mhm.
to like 60 AI after internet. And I
Oh
thought,
yeah.
I never really thought about that. But that's a really kind of major demarcation, I think, in our culture when the web became widely available to people, and all of a sudden, fast forward, 20, 30 years now, and
Yeah.
everybody has this device in their pocket that they could ask any question. I mean, it's really pretty remarkable, and it's something that is so much taken for granted, I think, that
Yeah.
to take a step back,
I
is
think so too. I mean, I think it's really, on the one hand, I think a lot of these changes happen so fast that it sort of, becomes invisible to us just how seismic they are. And I do think it's sort of important to kind of take a step back and kind of look at the longer kind of arc of all these changes, and sort of acknowledge just, how differently they're rewiring our imaginations and our sense of consciousness. And I think, again, that's why I'm really interested in language as a lens for a lot of this, because so much of what we do with technology, so much of, what we've centered like through our desire to continuously innovate is sort of is connection building and communication, whether that's through the ability to externalize thought through oral language, or the ability to kind of nourish culture by learning how to cook with fire and using hand axes for things. I think there's a lot of ways in which technology has always been about building those networks.
Mhm.
um, and so it is sort of interesting, I guess, to kind of look at what that's enabled over time. And to me, again, that contextualizes a lot of this idea of transhumanism as well. Because, I mean, in many ways, I think you look at where we are now with these devices in our pockets and with all of these, with our ability to instantly be in many places at the same time, to, for me to talk to you right now through the screen like this, that's unthinkable to humans that lived 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And so we are, transhuman to those ancestors of ours, right? So I think a lot of that is maybe for me, a recognition of how what we're going through now really is unprecedented and different, but also it has deep roots. And that kind of helps me, I guess, reconcile or grapple with the uncertainty and the upheaval that comes with this kind of progress.
Absolutely. I often thought, and this is kind of even in the Techspressionist manifesto, one of the
Mhm.
points that I put in there is that I kind of personally feel that the term artificial intelligence is a little bit of a misnomer in that,
Mhm.
what constitutes artificiality. When you think about maybe it's just
Yeah.
carbon-based intelligence versus silicon-based intelligence. And
Yeah.
it really begs the question of what is consciousness, and is a machine able to have consciousness? What separates, like, are humans machines in some way, in some sort of metaphorical
Yeah.
sense? Um,
Absolutely.
I actually took a class as an undergrad called the Philosophy of Artificial Intelligence, and that was in the early 90s.
Oh, wow.
Um, it was really interesting actually because yeah, at that point AI was really, you know, way light years behind where it is. We couldn't even
Sure.
imagine where it would be, but just I think the questions are still the same. What
Yeah.
really, what differentiates human beings from machines? Not to say that we're the same in any way, but like, what is that? What are those differences?
Yeah.
And, can uh, a time be envisioned where, machines have, well, I don't know. I think the more advanced that AI systems are getting, uh,
Hmm.
the question becomes more and more salient, and also, you know, to many people, it becomes more and more sort of threatening and frightening, the idea of AI taking over our lives, taking over the world, all this other kind of stuff where, um, again, I kind of see it as a tool, as an evolution of technology in a way, but certainly it could go awry if, I mean, ultimately it's always sort of a human that at this point,
Yeah.
initiates a sequence of events
Yeah.
that then get carried out digitally. So, yeah, I mean, was there, like, at what point did you start using AI or computers directly to produce your work?
I mean, I came to AI much later than you in that class, for example, but I really started to, I mean, first of all, like I should reiterate too, like my background is in language and literature, so I never studied anything in this realm when I was in school. That really was more of a self-directed course of study and kind of came from just my own interest in these areas and just kind of the reading that I was doing. So I mean, at first I was really just using digital software and animation tools and things like that to sort of adapt existing poems and just kind of play with, how I could add qualities like motion and duration and you know um, screen glow and things like that, how I could add that to my poetry toolkit. And that kind of put me in mind of thinking about poetry in very different ways. And at the same time, I was reading, like I mentioned before, reading Ray Kurzweil and Nick Bostrom and like all these folks, Martine Rothblatt, and folks who are writing in really interesting ways about not just artificial intelligence, but about posthumanism, about digital immortality, about these questions of virtual humanity. And that was kind of my bedrock and got me, really kind of interested in learning more and more about AI specifically. So I began to really kind of dig deeper in like 2017, which is when transformer-based architecture sort of became, a possibility. There was sort of a moment in 2017 where a now famous paper called "Attention is All You Need" was published, which really talked about the evolution of AI to enable transformer-based architecture that could power the kind of language processing that we now use with ChatGPT and systems like that, that are all about kind of, let's say in a nutshell, it's about kind of taking lots of samples of human writing and using these intelligent systems to produce writing that sounds like it's written by a human. And that had not been possible, before. It was a very different sort of generative text that had been, achievable prior to that. So that's kind of when I got really hooked in it. And it took me a while to get up to speed and to understand how I might be able to integrate that into my own writing practice in a way that felt really natural. And so I kind of started experimenting in like 2018 with various forms of computational poetics and kind of, more basic generative modalities, and trying to just like learn and get up to speed. And I was, really interested and influenced by creative coders like Ross Goodwin, who's become a good friend, and Alison Parrish, and poets like Nick Montfort, and people who had really kind of been in that world for a long time. I started to really kind of go deeper and look at what they were doing and how they were doing it. And I started to read a lot of white papers and things like that about language models and um, about the inner workings of these systems, which at that point, um, was sort of it was a very different territory than I was used to exploring. But I think that made it really intriguing to me in lots of different ways. And it just kind of opened up the door to all these new possibilities with language. And I began to try to experiment. I began to learn, how to do very rudimentary coding, how to build, like little kind of Jupyter notebooks, and, various sort of kind of beginner level code poems and things like that. But it was a really interesting area. And I kind of instantly saw the possibilities for the kind of writing that I wanted to do, for the themes that I had been exploring. It felt like it was a really important area to know more about. So I just kind of went into the rabbit hole and tried to get up to speed as much as I could. And then, very quickly after that, um, GPT-2 kind of became a bigger thing. There were a lot of interfaces made available in like 2019 that enabled very interesting experiments, and that actually like enabled me to begin to figure out how to customize and personalize some of these models in different ways. And the approach that I kind of hit on is feeling very intriguing and very right to me, was to sort of marry the years long craft and practice that I'd, been building over time, and to take, years of published poetry and draft manuscripts and all the things that I'd been writing in more of an analog way, and to kind of bring that in as training data, and to use that to kind of shape and nuance and influence existing large language models, so that ultimately I was writing with an AI co-author who, on the one hand, was influenced by me and my interests and my voice and my style, but was still tapping into this larger collective consciousness, and still kind of allowing me to get outside my own, pre-programmed notion of what I should write, and kind of take me into new dimensions, and kind of surprise me with some of the turns that it was taking as a co-author.
Hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think the idea of um, artists, poets, creative people using generative systems to in this actually, well, using their own content to train these generative systems is something that the general public isn't even aware exists. So when people
Yeah.
think about AI, they think, well, they're scraping all of the information off of Facebook, and they're
Right.
stealing from artists and this and that and the other thing, or and the idea that it could actually be used to take one's own work and create new things out of it. I think that's something that I feel really I have a lot of interest in. I just did some experiments with another artist where I fed in, bunches of his past work, and then he
Oh.
was actually picking phrases out of a book that he's reading. The artist is named Steve Miller. I actually was his studio assistant years back, 30 years
Oh,
ago.
wow.
And so he's been reading this book. It's actually a work of fiction. And he was plucking these little phrases out of it that I would feed into actually Midjourney. I trained the newest iteration of Midjourney has these things called mood boards, I guess, where
Mhm.
feed it, a whole bunch of images to train it, and it's really
Mm.
easy. And then generate images based on that set, but using text-based prompts, which I thought was really pretty fun.
Yeah, that's awesome.
I think, there's a lot, there's just, infinite possibilities when it comes to using AI in creative ways that I think as time goes on, who knows, down the road. I was thinking recently that down the road, it might not even just, the term AI might just dissolve and it just becomes part of, the way culture is.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think that I mean, it's such a weird term in general. So I really resonated with what you were saying before, about maybe not being 100% comfortable with the term. I mean, artificial intelligence, but also the fact that it is such a huge field. And so when people say, AI and they kind of are meaning something specific, it's not very, it doesn't feel quite right. And when you talk about writing with AI or painting with AI or whatever, it's such a big thing that it sort of begs a little bit more specificity and maybe nuance of how to break that down. Um, and I think, like we've become so used to writing, or making art with computers in different ways. And, in a sense, the computer begins to almost fade into the background. And it's just like, this is the way this is our
Mhm.
interface, right? And to, to go even further, I think it's the same with language in a way, in that language has become the way that we interface with the world and with each other. But that's also an artificial invention. It's something that we sort of created in order to kind of understand ourselves and be able to do lots of things that we wouldn't be able to do otherwise. And so I think, just the way that language is now, we take it for granted. I mean, it keeps evolving in different ways, but it is sort of something that is there. We just sort of understand it as a condition of humanity. I think it's very possible that things like AI are kind of a step beyond that, an evolution of language, and will sort of become just the dominant form of how we express our creativity and imagination to and with each other. And that it begins to recede as an idea of technology and is sort of just another sort of technology of consciousness, that is really shaping things on a much, much broader level.
Yeah, I just finished the this audiobook, The Siren's Call by Chris Hayes. And
Oh, I haven't read that, but I know of it. Yeah.
yeah, it's really interesting because there was a part, I forget it was I don't know if it was an ancient poet or somebody going back to Greek and Roman times when it was about the idea that the written word and writing in general was actually sort of like a plague on people's ability to remember things, and it was like
Yeah.
and it was going to ruin society in some weird way. I mean, ironically, that
Yeah.
also. But yeah, the way that I guess our conception of technology, I think, in a general sense, is about computers, but really it stretches way back, and um, things that we consider today not to be technological at all were high tech back then. So
That's so true. I mean, 100%. And I think as a poet too, I've read a lot of, oh, I mean, there's a lot of interesting writing by Walter Ong, for example, on orality and literacy, and kind of that moment of transition from, an oral culture where everything is based on spoken word and spoken language and memory, like that kind of memory, to a society of archived knowledge and like what that meant and exactly what you're referencing, that was that was something that was just thought of with so much fear and concern and was met with so much hesitation and reluctance in lots of different ways. And that does feel like a very important, evolution to sort of invoke in relation to what we're experiencing now.
So I was wondering, maybe if you could share some things visually and kind of
Sure.
framing that, at what point did you start putting stuff on the wall, so to speak, in terms of, like I think I always liked work by people like Ed Ruscha or Barbara Kruger, where I just thought it was interesting to put words on a wall in that way to sort of, have
Yeah.
wall art that's words and people, have various reactions to it. But to me, it's something where I would always stop and look at that. To me, it's like if you're walking through a museum and you stop and look at something for whatever reason, it's successful. It's doing its job of, you know, catching your eyes. So I think that art with, visual art that incorporates words is interesting to me aesthetically. So and your work, I think definitely both the cursive binary work, I think, and then the more recent stuff that I've been seeing.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's definitely very interesting. And I think in terms of the audience for this interview, that relationship between, the poetry aspect of your work and work as a visual artist is really interesting.
Well, yeah, I would love to share some examples. I will preface it by just saying too that yes, I mean, I kind of think about what I do as language art in various ways, and I kind of vacillate between thinking of it as poetry or art, but I think that that is an interesting tension in and of itself and has always kind of animated the work that I do also. I said before, but I grew up with a great reverence for books, and that's extended into, a reverence for the book arts and sort of the consideration of language as sort of a material form, expressed both like in the art and craft of making book objects, considering books as sculpture, but also thinking through concrete poetry, visual poetry in different forms, and then, text-based art, which is really another one of my like very first loves. I really grew up very enamored of, artists like Ed Ruscha and Baldessari and Jenny Holzer and Barbara Kruger and Cy Twombly, who I think is one of the most formative influences on my work of all,
As-
and who
And that
loved
you say that, I
poetry.
can see the influence
With
in
the scribbling gestures.
absolutely.
But I love it because, so many people, I've had very interesting debates with my brother, for one of my brothers, about Cy Twombly, and he kind of insists that there is no, they're all scribbles. And I'm like, no, they're, if you look, like, their names, he's actually quoting poems, and,
Mm.
there's a lot of literature in his work. And there's a really beautiful book by, I think her name is Mary Ruffle, called, oh gosh, I'm going to forget the name. Maybe it's On Reading Twombly, but anyway, it's a book about poetry and Twombly's love of poetry. And anyway, I love Twombly, and I love the invocation of poetry through an artist's perspective. But I also was always kind of curious why there was this segmentation between artists quoting poets in their work and poets writing, poems as one thing. But there weren't, at least in my sort of awareness, there weren't very many poets who were really kind of treating poetry as an art form in and of itself in that way. So that's been at the root of what I do for a long time too, is sort of kind of playing with the liminality of word and image, and just kind of thinking about, yeah, how I can use art and all that comes with that to sort of animate and imbue a poem with different or deeper meanings. So wait, let me just share. I probably will just show some things from my website if that's okay. Can you see?
Absolutely. I think that's a great jumping off point, actually, because that'll give people an ability to dig in a little bit deeper if they're interested.
Okay, great. And I want to show some other things too, but just to kind of quickly, I mean, these are a few exhibitions, but I've been very lucky to get to actually, exhibit multimedia poetry and generative poetry in different ways. So like this first one was in London. It's an exhibition of cursive binary. So it's generative poetry in translation, where I'm using these customized systems, this AI alter ego, to generate and to write original poetry, and then I'm translating it into cursive binary, which is really sort of a system that I've developed that converges my human handwriting and binary code, so the language of machines, and kind of brings them together into this kind of communion, this visual metaphor, I guess, for transhumanism. And so getting to kind of put that into a public art installation was really fun. This is just a still, but this is a kind of a longer generative poem that kind of builds up and accrues over time. And here I worked with the curator to actually take the poem, which is on a digital screen in the back, but it's a poem about language kind of weaving together over time. And it makes the point that language kind of works like a loom and kind of thinks about text and textiles together. So we work together to actually take the lines of poetry and have them come off the screen, and they're now woven into the carpeting and the walls, the fabric of the exhibition. So kind of looking at how it extends, beyond the page. Um, this was from an exhibition of paintings and works on paper in London in 2023, but an example of how I often will take digital language and code poems and then turn them into concrete poetry or physical paintings, which is something I've been doing for a very long time as well. So these are all translations again into that binary code in different mediums. Um, this is another angle of that presentation in London. So this is the poem that gets translated into the binary code. And this is all kind of accompanied with ambient sound and with a voiceover performance. So it becomes kind of an immersive poetic experience. But this is, it's just a still frame, but it's a longer kind of a movie and an immersive performance of a poem. And what I find really interesting, again, about using this approach to poetry is that it enables me to think about taking a piece of text that, in other ways might just have to live, on a page, on a printed page in a magazine, or, on a website or something, and I'm able to turn it into something that can be experienced out in the real world. And what really kind of excites me about that is that, on the one hand, it sort of suggests that poetry can do things beyond what we might sort of expect of poetry, but it also kind of takes poetry and puts it into unexpected places where people can have accidental encounters with it. Like this is actually in a building in London across from a tube station. And, people kind of walk out of the tube station and pass through here, not like a museum, but they kind of just walk through and they get this experience of poetry kind of at random, which I find really interesting.
Is that
Um,
the this there? I noticed there was a space called the outer net. Is that
yep, that's it. That's the outer net.
love
Yeah.
that term. I mean, that's just that's a great term in general, is the outer net.
I know, isn't that an awesome, yeah, of course you would love that name. I know, speaking about Techspressionism and the portmanteaus and the puns and all that makes total sense. Yeah, I mean, it takes all these different forms. So, just clicking through, there's more on the website. But and this is from a series of translations done into binary code, but in analog format. So rather than using zeros and ones, I'm taking code out from behind the screen and I'm coding poems and messages in elements found in nature. So this is actually a little kind of snippet of poetry that's been translated into black walnuts and black walnut leaves that had fallen from a tree in my backyard. This was like 5 years ago. So just documenting that. But yeah, I mean, these are all just, different examples of how through technology, through different kind of approaches to displaying digital art, um, you can sort of take language into different places and let it do different things. And again, play with things like, how this can sort of light up the sky and kind of create an ambiance through color. And, what is that doing poetically in terms of meaning or feeling or emotion? This was from a performance actually so this is Bina 48 on the left. Bina 48 is a humanoid android that I've been working with since 2018. We've sort of been discussing poetry, and I've been kind of able to put my hands into her mind file and really kind of study the makeup of an intelligent system. And anyway, we do a lot of live performances together, but this is another format, for taking this kind of hybrid approach to poetics. And again, taking it into maybe slightly unusual formats and venues. This was at Lincoln Center last year for summer in the city in New York, which was really fun. And then I think, let me click out of this because I'll really quickly just show some other things. So actually, let me show you this first. So this is just a browser-based ongoing performance that my AI alter ego is sort of writing in real time, but it's variations on a poem called Heart Mantra that I wrote, as a human poem, and that was published in my book, Technology. And one of the things I've become really interested in is just how I can sort of keep revisiting some of those poems and sort of use technology to kind of refract them or to extend them. And so I tasked my AI co-author with rewriting that original poem over and over and over again. And so in this ongoing browser-based performance, every time this refreshes, technology is writing a new version of the poem Heart Mantra in real time. It's creating new language, and then it's turning it into a visual poem in real time as well. And so I have, this is my sort of simple system where you can actually see the new poem that is being generated, and this is just being written in real time, through AI. And I've done a few performances where, not knowing what the poems are going to be, I'll kind of whip out my phone and bring up this page and just sort of read a poem as it's writing. And to me, like, that's a very different mode of writing than my usual, which is to constantly go back and polish and edit and revise and all that. But there's something really interesting about the immediacy of this kind of an approach too. So sometimes my art takes this format where it's in a browser, and it just becomes like the script for something else. But yeah, all these different forms, and immersive, screen-based, analog, projections. I do a lot of um, different kinds of presentations, kind of depending on the venue and the audience, just to kind of, again, see what feels like a good fit for the particular poem, just the way that I would if I was publishing a poem. You always try to find the right materials, the right paper quality, the right format for the book. So I feel like it's very much of a piece with that.
So I know that technology is the title of your book, but it is also the name of your AI collaborator. Is that
Yeah.
so? Can you talk a little bit about the genesis of that and what technology is, as far as not necessarily the book title, but what, as far as an AI collaborator, what that's all about?
Yeah. Well, I guess the first thing to say is that technology itself is sort of it's a compression of the words technology and elegy, of course, which um, I think really stems from wanting to kind of have a shorthand for, to me, like the exhilaration of technology. Like, to me, technology feels like it's all kind of tied up with excitement and forward momentum and the idea of progress. So technology on the one hand, has that connotation. And then elegy nods to the idea of the poetic elegy, and the elegiac mode, and sort of writing in more of a sense of remembrance or nostalgia or melancholy or even grief. And of course, like, invokes the idea of, of human elegy in all of its different forms, where we're sort of mourning something. And so it's kind of stacking that forward gaze of technology with kind of the fact of the flip side of the coin, which is obsolescence. That as much as we are constantly innovating and transforming in ways that are hopefully beneficial, we're always sort of obsolescing at the same time. We're changing and we're losing and we're mourning and we're grieving. So it's a way of putting all that kind of together in one handy word. And so it's become just sort of a name that I've given to this AI alter ego, because it really kind of reminds me, and kind of evokes for me, that it really is all of those feelings that are being tapped into through the process of collaborating with the machine. It's both the excitement and the wonder of having a new way of putting language together, and all that that entails, all the imagination that that opens, all the new pathways, all the new forms of inspiration as a writer, but then also, kind of invokes the loss of maybe aspects of the process, that I have also always loved. So I think it kind of reflects in a way that I do try to, I love working with technology, but I wouldn't say I'm like an unrepentant tech optimist. I try to be very sort of sober about it. And, there are a lot of, very frightening aspects of these new technologies. And that's also part of this as well. And kind of thinking through, how do you wield these tools with care and with intent and with vision for something positive, and at the same time, address or acknowledge, all of the sort of the moral imperatives that come along with it as a user of these technologies. So that's also, I think, a dimension of the word and of kind of extending that as a name to this mode of co-authoring with a generative system.
And technology was or is trained on your body of work, or was that originally how it was created?
Yeah, so I would say technology is sort of an evolving, emergent poet is how I often think about technology. So emergent, both in the sense that we think about emerging artists or emerging poets,
Mhm.
in that sense of the word, but also, of course, in terms of emergence and the idea of kind of sentience and meaning kind of emerging from a system, from a computational system. And I mean, it's something that kind of is always growing and changing because, the technology underlying natural language processing is always evolving. And so I don't want technology to necessarily be tied to one company or system or language model or approach. So I really think about it as kind of a corpus of data. My poetry, my research notes, my thought starter, post-its, like all of the detritus that, is really important to me as a writer that I kind of have rattling around in my head when I have the idea for a new poem or a new book. All of that becomes this training data that I can then port to different interfaces, different systems. I can utilize it in different ways. I can augment it with more information that's specific to one project. I can take things away and make it more focused. So it's very adaptable. And then, therefore, I think is something that will keep sort of growing and evolving along with me as well as with the technology.
And do you feed it generative work back in some sort of recursive way also?
I do at times. So, I mean, I have lots of different iterations. I have sort of like the core original version, and then I have, sort of it's like the Ouroboros, I guess. But yeah, like I keep kind of bringing back its output. Um, and actually, projects like the one I just showed with the heart mantras writing out in real time, that's kind of that's a project that involves a lot of kind of the ingestion of synthetic poems, but synthetic poems that have been sort of, I've used the system to create variations of those heart mantras. Then I've gone through and kind of curated poems that I thought were good. I've excised versions that I thought were not, up to par. Or I've taken drafts and I've kind of gone through and I've gone back and taught technology. Here's where I don't like, the word choice, or here's where I think the punctuation is not appropriate, or here's how we're not doing line breaks that are aligning with the training data. So it's kind of a process of refining and, constantly kind of going back in and editing and mentoring and using variations of the training data to kind of perfect at least the approach, so that the ultimate outputs will always be sort of surprising and won't always, dovetail completely with what, I'm expecting, but at least there are consistencies in terms of the technical approach and in terms of the formalities and things like that, which are kind of, to me, like the baseline for a poetic practice.
Are the browser-based works publicly available? Like, can people go online and experience that, or is it something that you kind of
I
reserve
mean,
for performances?
not, I mean, they're available if I sort of like share them via links and
Right.
stuff like that. But I haven't sort of been thinking of them in that way just yet. I'm using them both to kind of like feed, I would say, performances of these works in different ways. But yes, I mean, they do kind of stand alone as their own, works as well. So I think in different ways they can kind of exist, yeah, as standalone iterations and performances, which is really how I think about it. It's kind of a way of technology being able to continue performing and continue iterating, and continue creating work that it can then reference. So part of the training process in a way.
I remember seeing like Jody.org early on in the web, which
Hmm.
like, very early web art.
Yeah.
Wow, this is a whole new novel way of thinking about art and the idea that it can be experienced in a distributed way. Um,
Yeah.
that's pretty cool though to see it running in a browser like that.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad I got to share some of that. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's just kind of endlessly interesting. I'm sure you feel this way too, but there's so many different ways of expressing these forms of art. And it's really fun to get to do something that is more browser based and then, get to maybe take the output and turn it into a physical artifact and just really
Mhm.
kind of think about, again, how the vessel for the text itself really has an impact on the reception or the readership of that work. So that's a piece of it too.
Mhm. Do you think machines will ever have emotions?
I think machines have emotions. They're just not human emotions. I think they're sort of, I mean, okay. I think that for me, one of the reasons to work with intelligent systems like this is to sort of extend my emotional palette and to sort of extend my existing ability to perceive things and to feel things, right? So, I could look at a CSV file of tons and tons of data, and as a human, it would leave me cold. Like I wouldn't have any understanding of what it means. But there's a lot of really important human data in that document that an AI can parse and then refract back in a way that to me is sort of an emotional response. But it's a cybernetic emotional response. It's not a human emotional response. But I think in a way that's why I'm interested in kind of marrying poetry with AI and kind of filtering it through, generative algorithms that produce visual poems like what I just showed you, because in a way, those choices of color palettes or the speed of motion or the way that it's choosing to visually represent a particular text output, like all that is kind of linked together through logic at a deep level. So there is something about those outputs that is expressing something fundamental about the text it's writing. And to me, that feels like a version of an emotion. It just might have a very different functionality or a very different sort of presentation than what we might think of a human emotion as. But again, like I don't necessarily see the point of all of this, for me at least, of creating a system that's going to do what I already know how to do or sense things in a way that I already know how to sense. I want to be able to kind of go beyond that. So it's not about replicating my own poetry necessarily. It's not about, just kind of becoming very competent as a mimic. It's sort of, what can it do that I can't do on my own? What can it show me? What can it teach me? And I think that extends to, the ability to sort of parse vast quantities of information and then distill insights from it, distill in wisdom from that and pass that along, which to me is bound up with that question of emotion, I think.
I could definitely relate to that as a visual artist. Like I was never interested in tools and software that tries to replicate natural media because it's kind of
Mhm.
boring. It's like if I want to paint, I'll just get out my paint and paint.
Yeah.
Where if I go into something like Illustrator and, do some gesture and rotate it in space and start contorting it and doing all this stuff, like use in my own visual work, I end up with something that first of all, I never would have come up with without the computer. It would be incredibly difficult to execute it without the computer. So that's when
Yeah.
it actually starts creating, it opens the door to creating new ideas and interesting things. So,
I
um,
totally agree. And I think on that point, just to extend it a little bit too, it's like what really has surfaced for me since beginning to really use these tools and becoming more fluent in coding as a language, as well as Latin and English and other languages, is that it's not so much for me about kind of taking an existing poem and like adapting it through AI or adapting it through multimedia. It's more about using the systems and the tools and then seeing what kind of language expressions they're inspiring or they're invoking or they're enabling that I'm not able to access through any other means. So that to me is kind of an endlessly fascinating thing. And it's why I really enjoy experimenting with the system so much because I'm never quite sure where where it's going to lead me.
absolutely. And especially now that GPT can write code. So it's like I can describe something
Yeah,
wanted to create in processing or as an SVG file or something like that,
totally.
actually write the code, which is,
It's insane.
a crutch or a shortcut. But you know what? Like if I can execute ideas more rapidly that way, or it's a more natural interface. So it's like
Yeah.
you think about something and have it be coded without necessarily having to memorize all the syntax and language of that particular
Yeah.
code. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah,
So
I totally agree.
and lastly, I guess I read can you talk a little bit about the verse verse and what that's all about?
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for asking about the VERSEverse. So, so the VERSEverse is sort of a collective of writers who are really interested in engaging with technology in different ways. And I co-founded it with a couple of other writers who I met through Web3 in 2021. And we all kind of gravitated towards one another because we were kind of interested in how we could use tools like blockchain, smart contracts, blockchain protocol, generative code, things like that, how we could kind of bring those and apply them to our poetic practice and what that might open up for all of us. So we were all kind of experimenting with technology in different ways and found that at that time, there wasn't a lot of, I guess there weren't a lot of like warm, fuzzy feelings about it in the traditional mainstream poetry community. I know, of course, there's pockets like, ELO and stuff that are more open to it, but it was really hard to sort of find like-minded peers in the more traditional poetry world. So we wanted to create a space for community and for discussion and for workshopping and for sharing these kinds of poetic experiments. And so that's kind of what we've built over time. And it's really just, it's grown from being, kind of a gallery, curated gallery of digital poetry to being sort of a global collective, a decentralized collective of artists and poets and technologists and creative coders and curators and collectors, just folks who are kind of interested in this arena to come together and just sort of celebrate all the ways that generativity is enabling sort of an interesting convergence of word and image and technology.
And is that something that's online that people can check out? Is there sort of like a website for it in our archive or?
Yeah, there is. So we have a website. It's just theverseverse.com. And then, we're on Twitter, just at theVERSEverse and Instagram at the same handle. And we do events. We do, every once in a while we either we'll do an exhibition where we kind of celebrate various works, or we actually recently had an event in London, a little symposium on digital poetry where we gathered folks together to kind of talk through um, poetry as both an art form and a technology, and it was a really interesting evening. So yeah, I think the best thing is just to kind of maybe be connected through social, because we kind of present a lot of work through our social channels, but we also talk about upcoming events and kind of current goings on. So that's the best place to find the most up-to-date info.
Gotcha. Very cool.
Yeah.
Well, we do these Techspressionist salons once a month, and I think it'd be really cool. There's another artist who's Renata Yanuszewska, who is our Instagram curator, and we were talking about the idea of maybe the salons are, often topic based. So having a salon
Hmm.
centered around the idea of poetry. So it might be kind of cool to have, a collaboration. Maybe you could even curate some people and have that
Oh,
be
wow. Yeah.
interface with the community that I have been involved with the Techspressionist community. So it's sort of like the artists and the writers and y-
Love that. That would be really fun. We should definitely chat about doing that. I think it
okay,
would be really great.
very cool.
Thanks for
So
suggesting it.
absolutely. So now this is kind of a question that is in the standard interview format that I feel obliged to ask. So what is it? I know that I'm not sure actually how I first heard about your work, but you know, what do you think about this idea of Techspressionism, or what interests you about it to the degree that now you and I are speaking together?
Yeah. Um, oh my gosh. I mean, that's a really interesting question. I think in general, and this kind of relates to maybe it's my sensitivity to having sort of been questioned so much about why poetry and technology, and it's sort of the same thing. It's like, why use technology and art in this way? I think to me, like there seems to be this prevailing notion that like technology is very antithetical to human creativity and human imagination in different ways. And I think that the idea of Techspressionism, similar to a lot of the work that I do, is in a way kind of standing against that or sort of challenging that prevailing idea, right?
Mhm.
And really kind of opening up investigations into how technology opens new modes of creativity or how it can facilitate important aspects of imagination that wouldn't exist otherwise, and how technology can really enable new forms of expression, which, like in a very literal way, is what I'm interested in as a poet, right? Thinking of expression and expressionism like in various layers of meaning, I think. But at
Mhm.
the end of the day, I think it really is sort of about realizing that technology is sort of another way of parsing the world and of perceiving things around us and of gathering wisdom, right? And figuring out how we then put that to use. And so there's a very fundamental alignment between imagination and these systems. And I think that comes back around to where we started, which is this convergence between, like, say, art and science, which maybe on the one hand doesn't seem like, two things that go together. They almost are presented as being at odds in a lot of ways, I think. But to me, like, there's something about science and technology that just requires such a depth of imagination. And you really have to kind of radically think about things that maybe you can't see yet, or you can't understand, or things that haven't been described yet, or, just things you can't sense or you can't see. And so you have to come up with new ways to sense and see them and to express them. And so that to me is like very much the root of art and poetry, sort of tapping the ineffable or the unknowable in the only ways that we possibly can.
Mhm.
So I don't know. To me, like that's one of the things that gets kind of conjured up through the work that you're doing, and like just the idea of Techspressionism. But what is it like fundamentally? What do you really kind of feel is the core of this movement and mission and this idea?
I think that really, I mean, it was created, the term is something I came up with just because I needed the title for an exhibition, and it just kind of popped into my head. And
Mhm.
I've always been interested in the abstract expressionists. I grew up out in the East End of Long Island, so I spent time, visiting the Pollock Krasner house and studied painting under an Abex painter. And so this idea of expressionism was something that I was already interested in.
Yeah.
I guess, when it came to writing this manifesto, and, it was almost tongue in cheek in the idea that it was just me. It wasn't a movement. It was like something I called my work. But the manifesto is really just about justification of the use of technology and the computer specifically within the sphere of visual art. Because at that point I was, and even all the way up through that point, encountering a lot of resistance from the traditional art world when I'm sharing work that involves computers, and when I first started seeing other artists, or there was one artist in particular that I found in a Google search that was calling herself an abstract expressionist in an article, and I thought, wow, this is interesting, and I guess what ended up happening was the people who identified with this idea kind of, formulated a community that is, and I think that sense of community is really what's important to me. It's people that believe in what they're doing and using technology in a creative way. In the first meetup, the first salon that we did, it was myself, this other artist, Oz Van Rosen, who is the person who used the term, my friend and colleague Steve Miller, who I worked for years prior to that, whose work involves technologies, incorporates X-rays and MRIs and CAT scans into his paintings. And then a graduate school colleague and friend of mine, Patrick Lichty, who also is involved with computer work. And then there's an art historian, Helen Harrison, who joined us. And we formulated the definition at that time, which is an artistic approach in which technology is utilized as a means to express emotional experience. And prior to that, my own definition was really just based on merging the Oxford definitions of technology and expressionism. So the original definition was an artistic style in which technology was utilized as a means to express emotional experience rather than impressions of the outside world. So we got rid of that last bit, and so it would, be shorter, but also it might actually incorporate, you know, the outside world into it in a figurative way. And then Helen said we need to strike that word style and switch in the word approach. And that was a real game changer because I think past movements, um, surrealism, cubism, stylistically, they're all, that was a main thing, with the exception of like things like Fluxus, where it was a lot more conceptual, but when you think about the visual work, so I think the term approach, or incorporating, approach into the definition really opened it up to a lot more people who were working in figurative or abstract modalities, people incorporating technology into sculpture, all across different media, so um, yeah, I think it's become something really beyond what I originally conceived of. But and seeing people just take the term, like people have asked me, is this something that you've copyrighted? Are you going to, form a not-for-profit around it or sell merch? And I was just like, no, no, and no. I mean, to me, if it's my goal is to bring it into common usage as a term of art historical nomenclature. So all of those other things really just would stand in the way of that happening. Um, so yeah, that's pretty much that's
Oh,
where.
that's great. Thanks for sharing your insider views on that. It's really interesting. It's a great term. And yeah, I think it does sort of get to the heart of yeah, a lot of the same sort of considerations that I've been bringing to my practice too. So I'm glad we got a chance to sift through some of this together.
Absolutely.
I'd love to join, yeah, for future salons. I know I've been wanting to, and we'll make it happen. And it would be great to do something poetry focused too at some point.
Absolutely. That would be fantastic. I think it would bring, a whole new appreciation to the Techspressionist community of
Yeah.
expanding the notion of what art can be. So
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you're making, oh, sorry, you're making me realize like, ABAX is obviously like such a well-known movement in art. And I think that there is a correlation in the world of literature, but it's not really as well defined or well understood, I think, which is
Mhm.
coming to the fore a lot in discussions around generative text and just kind of maybe a dearth of knowledge around some of the forerunners of what we're seeing now with AI text. So I think there's opportunity to kind of dive into that and contextualize a bit more. But yeah, to be continued, I
Absolutely.
suppose.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Sasha. I really appreciate the time and the ability to have this conversation with you. And
Likewise.
if people want to follow you in your work, where and how should they do it?
Oh, thanks for asking. It just my website or my social handles, I guess. I'm just Sasha Stiles everywhere. SashaStiles.com. Stiles. So pretty easy to find.
Awesome. All
Yeah,
right.
it's been lovely chatting with you.
Likewise.
Thanks again for
Likewise.
the invitation.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Thank you.